want to talk a little bit today about the power to do the impossible. Those of you who made it to my talk yesterday will remember that I defended, among other things, a view according to which omnipotent beings should be able to do absolutely anything, even impossible things. I won't go so far as a full defense of that view in this talk, but I will take issue with a common objection to that kind of view and show some reasons that I think the objection is no good. Or at least that's one way to interpret what's going on here. So there are a bunch of arguments in the, somewhat recent literature that have roughly this form. So we start with the claim that if X has some necessary property, then there's no possible world in which X brings about or actualizes some state of affairs. Right? So a state of affairs could be any set of objects and their properties, like the chairs in this room are arranged in a certain way. That's a state of affairs. And I have the power to actualize that state of affairs by going around and adjusting each chair so it's in exactly this position. Right? So the first premise here starts by noticing that if you have a certain kind of property necessarily that is in every possible world, then there are certain states of affairs that you don't actualize in any possible world because you have that property. Second premise then says that if there's no possible world in which X actualizes the state of affairs A, then X does not have the power to actualize A. That seems plausible to an awful lot of people. And then the third premise says that if X does not have the power to actualize A, then X is not omnipotent. So the rough idea here is that not having that power counts against your omnipotence. Right? So one of the other things I talked about yesterday is we might think not having some powers doesn't really make you not omnipotent. So for purposes of these kinds of arguments, we want to insist that that's the kind of power we're talking about. It's one that counts towards omnipotence. And then the conclusion we get is that if X has this property necessarily, then X is not omnipotent. So the argument schema on its own is maybe not that informative. Some examples might help here. So we might think, suppose we're imagining a God that is both omnipotent and necessarily omniscient, that is, knows everything in every possible world. Well, here's something that God can't do: learn a new fact. Right? Because there's no possible world where there's something that it doesn't yet know that it can then learn. Right? The sort of the state of affairs where that thing learns a new fact requires there to be an unknown fact for that being. Or if that being exists necessarily, then it can't cause itself to not exist anymore, right? Because then it wouldn't exist necessarily. So we have these kinds of necessary properties. The reason people are interested in these kinds of arguments, right, are that these are the properties that God is supposed to have, like necessary existence, necessary omniscience, even necessary omnipotence. You can set the case up that way, and then you get the paradox of the stone. So lots of arguments like this. A lot of people say, well, the way out is just to deny 3 and say that these aren't the kinds of powers you have to have in order to be omnipotent. I say you can do that if you want, but you don't really need to, because premise 2, it turns out, is not well supported, at least not by the people I have in mind. So the usual support for premise 2 comes from this necessary universal principle, necessarily for any X and A. If there's no possible world in which X actualizes A, then X does not have the power to actualize A. So we can sort of sloganize this as power entails possibility. I was going to call it PEP, but we had a PEP in the last talk, so I'm glad I didn't do that. So we'll go with PP, which has its own problems, but we'll try not to focus too much on those. So that's the principle that I'm taking issue with. That's the primary project in this paper. We'll do a few other interesting things, but the basic idea is just that I think that principle is unmotivated. So here's a first kind of quick intuitive problem for PEP. I think that it's not totally crazy to think that a possible being might have a power that it just necessarily never uses. Right? So this is an idea that I'm shamelessly stealing from Earl Coney. And you might just think, well, sure, there's this thing, it has this power, but in every possible world where this thing exists, it has some compelling reason to refrain from using that power. Or maybe it's a being that's necessarily indifferent to the state of the world, so it just never takes any actions. But it doesn't seem to immediately follow from that it doesn't have the power to take any actions. Or maybe it's afraid of doing the wrong thing, right? And necessarily so. So in every possible world, it never takes any actions. Still, it doesn't seem obvious that it doesn't have the power to do anything. Now we might also sort of work our way up to this by thinking about other kinds of cases. So I'm not currently exercising my power to sit down, but I still have that power, right? We have people who have powers that they never use. Garfield never used his power to veto a bill. I think that's true. And so this is just that, but at every possible world, right? Every time, every world, you're not using the power. So if you think it's at all intuitive that a thing could be like that, you have to give up PP, because PP says that's impossible. Second problem. So imagine Ted. Ted is a maximally excellent hunter. So whatever goes into making a good hunter, whatever properties make you good at hunting, Ted has all of them to the maximum possible degree. So he can kill any possible beast, no matter how we construct it, no matter what kind of fantastic Star Trek alien beast you create. Ted can kill it. He's that good. But here's an impossible kind of beast, a deer with exactly 3 and exactly 4 legs. Right? Those properties aren't compatible. Nothing can have both of those properties simultaneously. So there are no possible worlds where Ted kills a 3- and 4-legged deer, we'll call it. Right? Nevertheless, it seems to me that Ted has the power to kill such a deer. In fact, it seems to me that killing that kind of deer would not be too much more difficult than killing a regular deer, and Ted certainly has the power to do that, right? And in fact, we could say pretty sensible things like what it would take to kill a 3- and 4-legged deer is to shoot it through the heart with an arrow or something like that. And it seems like Ted can do that perfectly well, right? He knows his way around a bow, let's suppose, as part of being a maximally excellent hunter. So it seems plausible to me that Ted has the power to kill that kind of deer, but does so at no possible world, which again is going to be inconsistent with PP. Okay, third problem. PP is inconsistent with some other principles about power that we might think look pretty good. That'll take a slightly complex case to see exactly how this inconsistency works. It's on your handout. I have a visual representation of it. Let's actually look at that before we look at the principles. If you can see that. Yeah, that doesn't look too bad. Okay, so the idea is that we have these 3 beings, A, B, and C. B exists at all of the worlds where A exists and all of the worlds where C exists. But A and C don't coexist at any worlds, right? Their existence is incompatible. You might sort of wonder how this story could possibly come to be. Here's my short story about A, B, and C. So suppose that A and C are both necessarily descended from B, and B necessarily has only one offspring, right? So only one of A and C can possibly exist, and one of them has to exist in all of the B worlds. So now let's think about 2 principles about power that I think are plausible that are going to generate a problem for PP in this case. So the first is that if X is more powerful than Y, then X has the power to overpower Y. So the power to overpower is just a thing I'm making up, but it's exactly what it sounds like, right? It's like we match my power up against your power, and whoever wins has overpowered the other person, right? So if I have the power to do that to you, then I have the power to overpower you. That's all I mean by overpower here. And so the idea is, well, if X is more powerful, then X has the power to overpower Y in this kind of direct contest of power. That seems plausible to me. And then the other principle here is roughly that having the power to overpower is transitive. So if X has the power to overpower Y, and Y has the power to overpower Z, then X has the power to overpower Z. Right? So the idea is that this power to overpower is going to come down to your overall amount of power. So if X has more than Y and Y has more than Z, then X has more than Z. Again, seems like a plausible principle to me. So now let's add some details to the case to get the problem. So consider 2 worlds. One of them is an A and B world, W1, and one of them is an A and C world, W2. And let's say in W1, A is more powerful, A is more powerful than B, right? So no problem for PP there. They coexist at this world. It's fine. And then in W2, B is more powerful than C. And let's suppose that B is no less powerful in W1 than in W2. In fact, let's just keep everybody's power equal across the worlds because it makes life simpler. Okay. So it turns out that from these, we can get that A has the power to overpower C. Because A has the power to overpower B, right, in W1 in virtue of being more powerful by the first principle. B has the power to overpower C in W2, also by the first principle, right, because B is more powerful, right? But then A has the power to overpower B, and B has the power to overpower C, so it follows that A has the power to overpower C. But of course, that's impossible according to PP because they don't exist at any of the same possible worlds. So there's no possible world where A actually overpowers C, so A can't have that power according to PP. So that's the idea there. Slightly complicated case, but the idea is, whoa. But the idea, help. I have no idea what's going on.
We're in another possible world.
Okay. Hello? Can anyone hear me? Okay, fantastic. Okay, so it looks like if we think these two principles at the top here are good principles about power, if those seem reasonable to you, then you're going to have an additional reason to reject PP on the basis of this kind of case. Or if you have a simpler case from those two principles, that would be fine too. So we've got these three problems for this principle PP. This is the principle that's supposed to motivate premise 2 in the arguments. So I say we've got a problem for premise 2 in those arguments. They're unsupported, at least they're unsupported by this principle. That's not the end of the party, though. We can do more here because these incompatibility arguments that I'm talking about, some of them don't appeal to states of affairs that are strictly speaking impossible. They instead appeal to states of affairs that are sort of impossible given certain contingent features of the world. So Wes Morrison has a paper where he says that God couldn't possibly be both omnipotent and necessarily morally perfect because God couldn't actualize some state of affairs that we think is evil, like an innocent child's being tortured. Well, at least some folks in discussions of the problem of evil are going to say, well, no, God could actualize that state of affairs if it served a sufficiently good purpose, right? If it were the only way to save the universe from destruction or the only way to achieve some really phenomenal good, in those kinds of worlds, God could actualize that state of affairs. So it's not really impossible. It's only impossible if, given the contingent features of this world, it doesn't lead to that kind of good. Another kind of case that you might think about is what? Making it true that Abraham Lincoln never had a beard, right? Nobody has that power now. Not even maybe, you know, the most powerful thing you can think of would have the ability to make that true or have the power to make that true now, you might think, because that's already settled. It happened in the past, right? Nevertheless, in other possible worlds, there are all sorts of people who have the power to do that by, say, killing Lincoln before he's old enough to grow a beard or some sort of enforced shaving ritual or something like that, right? So it's not that the thing is strictly speaking impossible, but it's impossible in worlds like this, given some contingent features of what those worlds are like. So if we're going to capture that kind of argument, we need a different principle because PP doesn't, it doesn't make those arguments valid. So what we need to do is instead have this principle that talks about not all the possible worlds, but the possible worlds that share certain states of affairs with the actual world. Okay, so here's the principle. Necessarily for all x and all a, if at no possible world W prime sharing S, where S is a set of states of affairs that hold at W, right? So these are the contingent features of the world here in W. If at no possible world sharing those features does X actualize A, then X does not have the power in W at T to actualize A. So we include a time variable to deal with the stuff about the past. And so if we have this kind of principle, then we can really generate the arguments according to an even more complex argument schema that get us the result that this kind of limitation in power makes a being not omnipotent. So the first problem for this PP prime principle is really a set of three problems. They're just the problems for PP, right? So the problems that we raised for PP were reasons for thinking you don't need any possible world at all where X actualizes the state of affairs in order for X to have the power to. So you certainly don't need a possible world sharing whatever goes into S, Right? If you don't need any of them, you certainly don't need one of these. So if you think I've already shown you compelling evidence that PP is false, you shouldn't even be worried about PP prime. We're already done. But just in case any of you doubt me, there are other problems for PP prime. First up, we have this case of the genie. So let's think about a very powerful genie who only actualizes the states of affairs that its master wishes for. It's the idea is like, I have the lamp, I say, genie, I wish you do this, and the genie can do anything I say, but the genie can only do the things I say, right? And now let's suppose that in one possible world, the genie has a master with a really powerful imagination. Let's suppose that's me. I have a reasonably good imagination. I say, genie, do all this cool stuff for me. Make a unicorn. Okay, my imagination's failing me, but I make the genie do lots of cool things in W1. In W2, the genie is bound to a kind of dull master with no imagination, maybe no interest in having cool states of affairs actualized. And so that master doesn't even sort of have the ability to wish for the things that I'm having the genie do in W1. So now if we include the dull master's control of the genie in S, that is in the states of affairs that we're using to evaluate PP prime, then PP prime is going to tell us that the genie does not have the power to actualize these cool states of affairs in W2, but it does have the power in W1, because that's not a world sharing S, right? So whether this is the right sort of thing to include in that set of states of affairs, people may disagree over. There are lots of different views about what should go into that set. But we can construct a case roughly like this for whatever kinds of things you want to include in there, whatever contingent features of the world you like. So that's an additional problem for PP prime that's not a concern for PP, right? This isn't a case where we don't have any possible world whatsoever. It's a case where we don't have a possible world with the right contingent features. Third problem is sort of the same problem, except instead of comparing two different worlds, we just compare two different times in the same world. So let the genie have the imaginative cool master at T1, and then later the cool master gives the lamp to the dull master, right, at T2, and now the genie has a new master, and let U be some cool exotic state of affairs like making a unicorn. So now there's this principle that I think looks pretty good, or I should say I used to think it looked pretty good. I've been convinced that there's a counterexample to this principle. But if we restrict ourselves to the right kinds of states of affairs, I think it might turn out to be true. So with a caveat, let's say this principle is plausible. If X has the power to actualize A at T1, then X doesn't have that power at some later time, T2, only if X's power has decreased. Now, that doesn't necessarily have to be like a net decrease in power. You might lose power in some respects and gain power in some other respects and come out overall ahead. But the idea is that you can't lose the power to do something without losing some power, right? Your power level has to go down in order for you to lose power. So if PP prime is true, then the genie has the power to bring about U at T1 when the imaginative master is in control, but doesn't have that power anymore at T2. So if that's right, then according to DP, the genie's power has decreased over time because it's gone to the new master. But that doesn't seem true. It seems like the genie's power has stayed the same, but the genie won't actualize interesting states of affairs anymore because the new master won't wish for those states of affairs anymore. So if we want to sort of put more pressure on this idea, you might think, well, suppose I want to steal the lamp from the dull master. Well, what's my motivation, right? The dull master isn't having the genie do anything, right? Because of the dull master's control, the genie, in fact, won't do anything fun. So what is it that I'm doing? What am I trying to accomplish by stealing the lamp? Is it that I think I'll steal the lamp and that will make the genie suddenly much more powerful? That does not seem like the right intuitive explanation of the story to me. It seems like I think the genie's already powerful. The dull master is wasting the genie's power, right? And so I'm going to steal the lamp and do all the things that the genie already has the power to do. Okay, so if that kind of thinking is right, then we have a third reason to doubt PP prime. So we've got a set of 3 reasons to doubt each principle here, and reasons to doubt these incompatibility arguments, to think that their second premises need some other kind of support if they're not outright false. But there's more we can do with this problem for these kinds of principles in our hands. We can actually illustrate something important about the nature of power and how it's related to other, maybe even seemingly equivalent things like ability or choice. And that might be important because you might think, well, you should only be required, that is morally required, to do things you have the power to do. Maybe you should only be held morally responsible for your choices, right? So things like power and choice matter in the world. And so if we can learn something new about power, choice, ability, how they're related to each other, that's a cool thing to learn. So there are these 2 rules from the consequence argument for incompatibilism and the free will debate. I'm not especially interested in that argument, but I'm interested in these inference rules. Without these inference rules, that argument's invalid, and so we have one less reason to think that free will and determinism are incompatible. But what I'm really interested in is what looking at counter instances to these rules can tell us about some different related notions. So the idea is we have this inference rule alpha, and box P is something like metaphysical or logical necessity of P, so P is true at all possible worlds. And then NP could be a few different things, but the idea is roughly that the truth of P is not up to anyone, and we can understand that in various different ways. So I have 3 ways that we can understand that here. No one has or ever had the power to make P true or false. No one has or ever had a choice about whether P is true or false. And no one is or ever was able to make P true or false. And it turns out that those aren't equivalent because in the case of some of them, we get counter instances to alpha and beta, and in the cases of others, we don't. So let's think first about alpha on the first reading. So we're thinking about power here. So alpha says if you have that P is a necessary truth, then you can infer that no one has or ever had the power to make P true or false. Well, if we think about things in that way, if we use that reading of N, then Ted's case is going to be a counter instance to rule alpha, right? Because it's necessarily true that Ted never kills a 3- and 4-legged deer, right? So if P is Ted never kills a 3- and 4-legged deer, then box P is true. But it's not true that no one has or ever had the power to make that proposition true or false. Ted has the power to make it false by killing a 3- and 4-legged deer, right? So if the intuition that at least I have about Ted's case is right, then we have a counter instance to rule alpha, which as far as I know, no one else has come up with, although other people probably understand it more in the second way than the first. Nevertheless, a counter instance to alpha, pretty cool. We also have a counter instance to beta here from the genie's case. So this one's a little bit trickier, so I'm going to read a little bit so that I don't say something obviously false. Well, so that I don't say something obviously false that wasn't what I intended to say. So let P be this conjunction that the genie is eternally bound to the dull master and the dull master never wishes for you, right, where you is some exotic state of affairs. And then assume that neither the genie nor anyone else has power over the truth of that conjunction, right? So the genie's stuck with the dull master. And the dull master will never get more imaginative. And no one can do anything about that. So if we read, if we read NP as 1, then we've got the first conjunct of what we start with in beta, right? We've got NP, where P is that conjunction. No one has a choice about it. So then let Q be the proposition that the genie never actualizes U. And then assume that no one has the power over sort of the way the genie and the lamp work. So no one can break apart the connection between the master never wishing for this state of affairs and the genie never actualizing the state of affairs. Right, so suppose that all those things are out of anyone's hands, then NP and N, if P then Q, are both true. So we've satisfied what we're starting with in beta, and then we're supposed to be able to infer from that that no one has or ever had the power to make to make Q true or false. We're supposed to be able to infer NQ, but remember Q is the genie never actualizes U. Well, that's false in this case, because the genie has the power to make that proposition false, right? The genie can go ahead the genie in fact won't, being bound to the dull master, but genie has the power to bring about the state of affairs U, which would make that proposition false. That case is a little bit harder to follow, not in print, but I'm happy to answer questions about it if that wasn't clear. But the idea is that Ted gives us a counterinstance to alpha on this reading. The genie gives us a counterinstance to beta. So we have counterinstances to these two inference rules. They're supposed to be good inference rules. Well, there are other counterexamples to beta, but we have a new one, so that's something. Okay. But here's where I think it gets really interesting. If we stop talking about power and start talking about choice, these counterinstances don't work anymore. Right? So think about Ted. Now, there are no possible worlds where Ted kills a 3- and 4-legged deer. It does seem that he has the power to kill a 3- and 4-legged deer, but he doesn't have any choice about whether he kills a 3- and 4-legged deer, because he has no choice over whether he exercises that power. He has no choice over whether he's ever in a circumstance where he could exercise that power. Right? So he does have the power, but he doesn't have a choice about it. So that's kind of interesting. Similarly, the genie has the power to create a unicorn, say, to actualize whatever the cool states of affairs are, but again, intuitively doesn't have a choice about whether he does so. Right? He's bound to whoever has the lamp, and in this case, that's always going to be someone who will never wish for that state of affairs to be actualized. So, again, assuming I'm right about everything I've said so far, we have counterinstances to alpha and beta on the power reading, but not on the choice reading. So this tells us that power and choice are different, right? We need different logics with different inference rules to talk about power and choice. That seems interesting all on its own, because sometimes we sort of freely float back and forth between those two, and even more so between, say, power and ability. Right? If we say someone has the power to do something, they're able to do that thing, we almost always treat those as just meaning exactly the same thing. But it's actually kind of unclear in this case whether we have counterinstances to these inference rules. So let's just talk about Ted. So here are two things that seem true about Ted. Ted is able, under certain impossible conditions, to render the proposition that Ted has killed a 3- and 4-legged deer true. Right? In the impossible scenario where he encounters a 3- and 4-legged deer, he could exercise this power and make that proposition true. So he has the power, but it's a power that's only exercised in impossible conditions. So that seems like there's some sense in which he's able to, right? He's able to if given the impossible chance to do it or something like that. Nevertheless, Ted is not able under any possible conditions to make this proposition true. And that seems like an important fact also. Right? It seems like maybe that's part of the fact that explains why he doesn't have a choice about it, right? Because none of the conditions where he could do it will ever possibly come up. So what do we say about Ted's ability to make this proposition true? There are a few different things we could say. Good enough for me anyway. So there are a couple things we could do. We could say that when we say someone is able to do something, maybe that's ambiguous between saying they have the power to do it and they have a choice about whether it happens. That's one thing you could say. We could say that ability claims are always relative to a certain set of facts. So Lewis, at least in one paper, thinks this about can claims. So he thinks like the time traveler Tim, who goes back in time to kill his grandfather, he thinks Tim can kill his grandfather is true relative to one set of facts, like just the facts in the past about Tim's constitution and his distance from his grandfather. But it's false relative to another set of facts, like including that the person is Tim's grandfather and that Tim wouldn't exist if the grandfather died at this point. Right? So we could tell a story like that. The idea roughly is that there are various linguistic choices we can make about how this ability claim is related to the other claims, but it's not just straightforwardly semantically equivalent. So we really shouldn't just interchange has the power to, is able to, has a choice about. But a lot of times we do, and especially people who make these incompatibility arguments do. So in addition to finding out that a whole bunch of arguments are bad, we've learned something about how power is related to other important concepts, and so that's why I think it's worth thinking about having the power to do the impossible. Thank you.